Number 5. Alissa Turney. May 17, 2001 was the last day of 17-year-old Alissa Turney's junior year at high school. It may have also been the last day of her life. On that day, Alissa's stepfather, Michael Turney, says that he picked her up at her Phoenix, Arizona high school and they went out for lunch. Michael said that Alissa became angry during the lunch because she wanted to have more freedom, and Michael said that wasn't going to happen. He then drove her home, and he left the house again at 1 o'clock, leaving Alissa home alone. Over the next 4 hours, Michael said that he ran some errands, and they picked up Alissa's younger sister, Sarah. When he returned home with Sarah, Alissa was gone. In Alissa's room, there was a note with her handwriting that addressed Sarah. It read, "Sarah, you wanted me gone. Now you have it." The note said that she was running away to California. Michael also said that a week later, he got a call from a telephone number in California. He said that he could barely hear the caller, but he was pretty sure it was Alissa, even though he said her voice sounded different. Michael tried to file a missing persons report on the night that Alissa went missing, but the police didn't investigate the disappearance because they thought that Alissa had just run away and she would return at any time. Alissa's family and friends said that it was very uncharacteristic of her to run away. She was close with her younger sister and her step-siblings, she had several close friends and a steady boyfriend, and she didn't tell any of them of her plans to run away. They also said that, like other teenagers, Alissa had a rebellious streak. She occasionally smoked marijuana, and every once in a while she would skip classes, but for the most part she was responsible. She was a good student, and she had a part-time job at a fast food restaurant. Finally, when Alissa supposedly ran away, she didn't take the things that most young women would take with them if they were to leave the house for an extended period of time. This included items like her cell phone, makeup, and her hairbrush. Also, she had $1,800 in her bank account, and there was no activity on the account after she went missing. In 2006, 5 years after Alissa went missing, a man named Thomas Heimer wanted to talk to the authorities about her disappearance. Heimer had been arrested 7 months after Alissa disappeared, and he was serving a life sentence for a murder he committed in Florida. For no apparent reason, Heimer strangled and stabbed a woman companion to death and then stuffed her body under a motel bed. In 2006, he mailed out letters to several police departments around the country, proclaiming to be a serial killer that claimed the lives of 21 women who were never found. He said that one of his victims was Alissa. When the police looked into his claims, they concluded that he was lying about killing Alissa. For example, he claimed that Alissa was a heroin addict, but none of her friends and family said that was remotely true. Heimer eventually took a polygraph test regarding Alissa's disappearance, and he failed. The police think that Heimer probably saw Alissa's picture in the newspaper or on the news, and he made up the story about killing her. Or he possibly killed another girl and mistook her for Alissa. It's unclear if Heimer was responsible for any of the murders he took responsibility for, or if he was just confessing to get attention. While Heimer most likely wasn't responsible for Alissa's disappearance, the confession got the police wondering who exactly was responsible for Alissa's disappearance. They started by looking at the most obvious suspect, which was the last person who saw her alive, and that was Michael Turney. Alissa's mother, Barbara, met Michael when Alissa was 3 years old. They got married not long afterwards, and Michael ended up adopting Alissa. Barbara died in 1992 from cancer, and Michael was left alone to raise Alissa and her younger sister. Michael was a very strict parent who wanted to control Alissa and her sister. He would go through their computers and their phones, and he recorded all incoming and outgoing calls. Michael also set up surveillance cameras both inside and outside the house. Some of the cameras inside the house were hidden, and no one else knew that they were there. When the police dug a little bit deeper, they had several witnesses come forward, and they believed that for many years Michael had been sexually abusing Alissa. A year before Alissa disappeared, Michael did something rather unusual. He called Child Protective Services, and he told them that if Alissa did call and accused him of sexual abuse, that they shouldn't believe her. Finally, Michael also wrote out strange contracts which he made Alissa sign. One contract, dated a year before Alissa went missing, stated that Michael had not sexually abused her, and Alissa had signed it. This led the police to believe that Michael killed Alissa because she threatened to expose the sexual abuse. The police tried to interview Michael, but he refused to cooperate. He would only talk to them over the phone or through email. He also refused to take a polygraph test. The police asked Michael if he had the surveillance footage from the day that Alissa went missing, and if he did have it, would they be able to see it? Michael said that he did have the footage, but it didn't show anything of interest, and he refused to hand it over. Instead, he gave them video clips from months before the disappearance that showed some teenage boys talking to Alissa outside the house. Finally, they asked Michael for a DNA sample, and once again, he refused. At this point, the police were tired of getting stonewalled by Michael, so they got a court order to get his DNA. When they went into his house, they made a startling discovery. Inside the house, there were 26 homemade bombs and 19 high-caliber rifles. A van on the property was also rigged with gas canisters so that the van would burst into flames. This led to the neighborhood being evacuated while the explosives were cleared out, and Michael was arrested on weapons charges. Once all the explosives were cleared out, the police continued to search the house. They found video footage of Alissa all the way back into the 1980s, but there was no footage of the day that she went missing. They also found a 98-page manifesto written by Michael called Diary of a Madman Martyr. In the manifesto, Michael says that assassins from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers killed Alissa. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Michael was an electrician. He stopped working in 1992 because he was injured, and then in 1993 he was laid off. 3 weeks after he was laid off, his wife and Alissa's mother, Barbara, died of cancer. In the manifesto, Michael said when he was working, he complained about safety conditions. In retaliation for his complaints, the union kidnapped Alissa, killed her, and buried her in the California desert. He also wrote that he had killed the 2 assassins from the union who killed Alissa, and that he was going to get the ultimate revenge. He was going to drive his van, rigged with the bombs, into a meeting at the Union Hall. He was planning on shooting as many people as he could, and then he was going to set off the bombs. The police think that it was an incredible stroke of luck that they went to Michael's house when they did. They went to Michael's house on December 11th, and the next union meeting was on December 15th. Michael said that the bombs weren't his, and they were planted there by the police. He did admit that he planned on committing suicide because he thought that it would bring attention to Alissa's case. In 2010, Michael was convicted of unlawfully possessing destructive devices, and he was given 10 years in prison. Michael has always denied being involved in his stepdaughter's disappearance, and Alissa Turney's whereabouts are unknown to this day. Number 4. Deborah Poe. In late 1989, 26-year-old Deborah Poe moved from Virginia to Orlando, Florida. In Orlando, Poe had 2 full-time jobs. During the day, she worked at the Orlando Sentinel in the retail sales department. Then, overnight, she worked alone at a Circle K convenience store. Poe's boyfriend was worried about her working alone at night at the store. On several of her shifts, men harassed her. In January 1990, a naked man came in and chased Poe around the store. Luckily, she was able to lock him out of the store. 2 weeks later, in the early morning hours of February 4th, Poe was working alone in the store. At 4 a.m., a call came into the 911 dispatch from the store. A customer had come into the store and found it empty. The police arrived at the store a short time later. They found Poe's car in the parking lot, and inside of it was her purse, her paycheck, and her keys. In the store, they found Poe's smock, and behind the counter they found a cup of coffee and a carton of chocolate milk. As for Deborah Poe, the 26-year-old was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle in the store, and nothing was stolen, so the police weren't even sure if Poe left on her own free will or if she was physically forced out of the store. The police brought bloodhounds to the store, and they found Poe's scent. They followed her scent to the rear of the store, and then over a fence, and then at a nearby road they lost the scent, so the police think that she either got in or was put in a car that drove away from the scene. After the disappearance hit the news, some witnesses came forward. One witness said that they were at the store sometime between 3:15 and 3:30 a.m. on the morning that Poe disappeared. She said that Poe wasn't in the store. Instead, behind the counter was a young man. He had long black hair and dark eyes. He was wearing a black Megadeth t-shirt that featured a dragon spewing fire, a skull ring, and in his right earlobe he had a wire earring with a cross. The witness wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, and the young man wasn't sure where they were. The witness had to point out where they were, and then she paid the man, who rang up her purchase on the cash register, and then he gave her some change. Half an hour later, the store was found with no one inside of it. The police do not know if the young man with the black hair was involved with Poe's disappearance. Another possibility is that he was just another customer. But why would another customer pretend to work at the store? Also, if the man did kidnap her, it doesn't make sense for him to leave the store with her and then return a short time later. That would suggest that Poe was somewhere inside the store or at the rear of the store when the witness came in to buy cigarettes. Unfortunately, the police have never been able to identify the young man in the Megadeth t-shirt. Deborah Poe's friends and family are hoping that one day the man will come forward and maybe he can shed some light on what happened to Deborah. Number 3. Robert Dunbar. The strange case of Robert Dunbar started on a fishing trip at Swayze Lake near Opelousas, Louisiana on August 23, 1912. At lunch, the Dunbar family walked back to their cabins and they realized that 4-year-old Robert, who went by the name Bobby, wasn't with them. The family searched the immediate area, and when he wasn't found, the police were called in. The search of the area was extensive, but the only trace of Bobby that could be found were a set of footprints that led to a swamp. Witnesses said that they remembered a strange man hanging around the swamp around the time that Bobby went missing. Since no body was found, the police concluded that Bobby had been kidnapped by the man in the swamp. 8 months went by, and then suddenly there was a break in the case. Not only had the police made an arrest, but they said that they found Bobby as well. William Cantwell Walters was arrested in April 1913 while traveling in a tented wagon with a young boy who matched Bobby's description. When the boy was brought to the Dunbar family, who lived in Opelousas, the town threw a parade and the boy rode in on a fire truck. Newspaper reports from the time contradicted each other, but apparently Bobby's parents, Percy and Leslie, weren't sure if the boy was their missing son or not. A major problem was that the boy didn't respond to the name Robert or Bobby. Another troubling aspect was that the boy didn't seem to recognize Bobby's older brother. Yet, the boy did look a lot like Bobby. Leslie was given the opportunity to bathe the boy, and when she did, she said that she recognized some birthmarks and claimed that the boy was her missing son Bobby. Walters, on the other hand, was adamant that the boy wasn't Bobby. He said that the boy was Bruce Anderson, and he was the son of a servant who worked for his parents. Walters said that the mother gave him Bruce to be a traveling companion, and they had been together for over a year. At this point, the story was making national headlines, and that's when a woman named Julia Anderson from Barnesville, North Carolina, came forward and said that the boy was her son Bruce. Just like Walters said, she was a servant of his parents, and she did give Bruce to him. She said that in February 1912, she gave Williams permission to take Bruce for a few days, but instead, he kept him for 14 months. She just had never reported Bruce missing, and thought that one day, Walters would return with her son. The case fascinated the country, and a newspaper in New Orleans paid for Julia to travel from Barnesville to Opelousas to see if she could identify her son. The boy was put into a room with 4 other boys that looked similar, and then Julia was allowed to enter. The boy didn't recognize Julia, and she wasn't sure which boy was her son. Eventually, Julia did pick the correct boy, but she couldn't say with certainty that it was Bruce. Since she couldn't definitively pick the right child, and since the boy didn't recognize her, the lawyers declared that Julia had failed the test, and this made headlines across the country. She begged for a second chance, and she asked for permission to undress the boy so she could check him for birthmarks. After all, at this point, she hadn't seen her son in 15 months. The lawyers agreed to give her a second chance, and she was able to undress the boy. This time, with much more certainty, she said that the boy was her son Bruce. But unfortunately, not being able to recognize Bruce the first time damaged Julia's case too much. The authorities didn't believe her story, and they refused to give her the boy. Julia was poor, and she didn't know anyone in Opelousas, so she was forced to return to Barnesville, and the boy was given to the Dunbars. Walters was convicted of kidnapping in 1914, and he was sentenced to life in prison. His lawyer appealed the conviction, and it was overturned on a technicality. He was released after spending 2 years in prison. The town decided not to retry him because the trial was so expensive the first time. As for Julia, she had 2 other children in Barnesville, but she lost both of them not long after she got back home. Her infant son suddenly died, and she had to give up her daughter for adoption. She would go on to marry, and she had 7 more children. She told her children that they had a half-brother who was stolen from her and given to another family. The boy grew up as Robert Dunbar, and he had 4 children. During his lifetime, he gave one interview, and he said that he remembered being kidnapped. However, many people who knew him said that he struggled with his identity his entire life. He died in 1966, and he was buried under the name Robert Dunbar. 33 years later, in 1999, Bobby Dunbar's granddaughter, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, started to look into the case. 4.5 years later, she got a DNA test, and it showed that her grandfather was not Bobby Dunbar. That means he was most likely Julia's son, Bruce Anderson. As for what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar is unknown. No trace of him has ever been found. Number 2. Nicole Morin. In the summer of 1985, Nicole Morin was 8 years old, and she was living with her parents in a penthouse in an apartment building in the Toronto, Ontario neighborhood of Etobicoke. On the morning of July 30th, Nicole put on her favorite bathing suit and sandals and said goodbye to her mother. She was going downstairs to the lobby to meet her friend to go swimming at the building's outdoor pool. The friend waited for Nicole for 15 minutes in the lobby, but Nicole never showed up. So her friend called her apartment on the intercom, and Nicole's mother, Jeanette, said that Nicole had already left for the pool. The friend waited for a few more minutes, and then she just figured Nicole couldn't come swimming for some reason, so she just went to the pool by herself. Hours later, when Nicole didn't return home, Jeanette knew something was wrong. The building was searched, but Nicole was nowhere to be found. The police were called, and it led to one of the biggest and most exhaustive searches in Canadian history. But sadly, not a single trace of Nicole has ever been found. It was as if she slipped through a crack in reality once she left her apartment. But of course, that isn't what happened. Nicole had been kidnapped, but by who? No one saw Nicole after she walked out of her apartment door, so it's not clear if she was kidnapped on her floor or on the elevator. What is known is that she did not make it to the lobby where her friend was waiting. The kidnapper could have been someone who was visiting the apartment building, like a guest or a maintenance person, and she was taken out of the building right away. But no one saw anything suspicious, like someone carrying Nicole out of the building. Another possibility is that she was kidnapped by someone who lived in the building, quite possibly on her floor. Both theories are just as plausible, but the police have no evidence to back up either. A woman was seen on Nicole's floor about 45 minutes before she disappeared. She was on the opposite end of the hall from the Morin's penthouse, and she was holding a notepad. She was described as a white woman, about 35 years old, 5'5" to 5'7", and she was slender with a fair complexion. She was wearing a white skirt with a black design and a white or cream blouse. The police don't think that she was involved in the kidnapping, but she may have witnessed something. A month after Nicole disappeared, Jeanette said that she felt in her heart that her daughter had been killed. Nicole's father, Art, says that he hopes that Nicole is still alive. He says that he still has hope because Nicole wasn't the only child that Jeanette had go missing. She had a son from a previous marriage, and his father kidnapped him. Then, one day out of the blue, after being missing for 15 years, her son surprised her by knocking on her front door. Sadly, Jeanette never found out the fate of the second child she had go missing. She died of a heart attack in 2007. 29 years after Nicole went missing, the police announced that they were reopening the case. Not long afterwards, a tip came in, and the police were told to search a rural property in the township of Springwater, Ontario, which is about an hour north of Toronto. This was the second time the police received a tip to search that area. The police had searched that area in 1985 because an anonymous phone call led them there. Both times that the area was searched, the police didn't turn up any evidence that Nicole's remains were there. The police and Nicole's father are hoping that one day Nicole will be found, and they are all praying that when she is found, that she is still alive. If Nicole is still alive, then she is 43 years old at the time of this video. Number 1. Edward Mapps. Edward Mapps was born in June 1922, and as an adult he was a sculptor, but he never held down a steady job. Instead, he lived with older women and constantly moved around. He dressed like a beatnik, and he wore sandals year-round, even though he lived in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, which has winters that aren't exactly sandal-friendly. In July 1960, when Edwards was in his late 30s, he married 21-year-old Christine Wolbach after only knowing her for 2 months. In September of 1961, Christine gave birth to a daughter named Julia Louise. On the night of January 21st, 1962, all 3 members of the Mapps family were visiting a neighbor. The neighbor said that it was a pleasant visit and they had given her a pie. They left her house around 9:05 p.m., and the neighbor said that nothing appeared to be out of the norm. At 10:48 p.m., a call came into the fire station in Stroudsburg. The Mapps house was on fire. The fire department arrived at the Mapps house a short time later. Inside the house, they found Christine and Julia Louise. Both mother and daughter were rushed to the hospital. Sadly, Julia Louise was pronounced dead on arrival. She had died from smoke inhalation. Christine died a few hours later, but the fire didn't cause her death. Instead, she had been struck 3 times in the head with a 4-inch blunt instrument. She died from a cerebral hemorrhage. The fire was an obvious act of arson. Most likely it was started to destroy any evidence at the crime scene. The rest of the house was searched, and they found Edward's wallet and some pieces of identification that belonged to him, along with some of his stocks, but he wasn't in the house. 3 hours after the fire was discovered, Edward was officially charged with the murder of his wife and infant daughter. And within hours, the local bus station, train station, and all the diners were checked, but no one had seen Edward. As the police investigated the case, they became more convinced that Edward was the killer. First off, the police really didn't like Edward's bohemian lifestyle. The police also learned that Edward had a history of mental illness. During World War II, he served in the Marines. After he was discharged in November 1945, he had to be hospitalized for his mental issues. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but in hindsight, he was probably suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't diagnosed back then. They concluded that Edward felt claustrophobic in his family life, so he beat his wife to death, and then using piles of clothes, but no accelerants, he lit 10 fires around the house. He then turned on the gas oven to 450 degrees and left the door open to hurry along the fire. He then simply walked out the front door and left his 4-month-old daughter to die inside the burning house. The fire did not engulf the house because it didn't get enough oxygen because the windows were closed. Had the windows been open, the house might have been destroyed. During the search for Edward, there were hundreds of unconfirmed sightings of him. Edward also supposedly called a few people on the phone. One woman, who said that she was a friend of Edward's, got a call from someone claiming to be Edward, and he said that he was going to kill her next. Another call was made to a man who knew Christine's parents, Robert and Julia. During the call, Edward apparently told the man to tell Robert that he forgave him. The man didn't know what Edward meant by this, and he didn't ask for clarification. Instead, the man encouraged Edward to turn himself in. Edward told the man to give his love to Julia, and then he hung up the phone. The police thought that the man was a credible witness, and the call removed any doubt from their minds that Edward was the killer. 6 months after the fire, Edward still had not been found, and he was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. He remained on the Most Wanted list for 5 years, and then the district attorney in Stroudsburg requested that he be removed for reasons that weren't made public. Then, on October 21st, 1971, Edward was declared legally dead. His body had not been found, and no reason was given for declaring him dead. To this day, Edward has never been found, dead or alive. Looking back on the case decades later, some investigators do not think that Edward killed his wife and daughter. They point out that all the evidence against Edward is circumstantial. The main argument that tries to prove Edward is guilty is that he wasn't found at the house. But that raises the question, how did Edward get away from the house? Both of the family's cars were in the garage with the keys in the ignition. No buses ran in that area, and the cab companies have no records of anyone calling for a cab at that time in that area. The fire department thought that the fire had been burning for about 40 minutes before the call came in at 10:48. That means Christine was attacked sometime after 9:05, which is when the maps left their neighbors, and 10:10 when the fire was started. Within 3 hours of the fire, Edward was the most wanted man in the city, but he somehow managed to get away undetected without his car or some type of public transit. This would suggest that Edward secretly had a third car, or he was driven away from the scene either by an accomplice or the real killer. Another problem with the police and the district attorney's case against Edward was that they didn't like his lifestyle, and they made unfounded judgments against him. They assumed that he was a mean loner, and he was secretly a gay man who hated his family life. But all of Edward's friends and acquaintances said that Edward was quite the opposite. They said that he was a gentle and kind man. A former neighbor of Edward told a story about how her husband had a terminal illness, and Edward spent time with her husband every day up until the day that her husband died so she could go to work. Also, everyone said that he loved his wife and adored his daughter. Friends and family of Edward also point out that he had nothing to gain by killing his family and running away. One last oddity that was found inside the house was that all of Edward's sculptures had been smashed. An alternative suspect that was theorized by a local paper in Stroudsburg was Christine's father, Robert Walbach. Robert had a violent temper, and he loathed Edward. He was strongly against Edward and Christine getting married, but he did allow the couple to live with him and his wife Julia. The more time Robert spent with Edward, the more his hatred grew. He thought that Edward was lazy, and he did nothing but sit around the house all day. Edward also didn't pay for anything, although Robert suspected he had money. Robert's suspicions turned out to be true. After the fire, the police discovered that Edward had a $30,000 trust fund, which he withdrew money from every month. When Edward went missing, the withdrawal stopped. It also annoyed Robert how entitled Edward was. When Edward was living with Robert and Julia, he would answer the phone and say, "Maps residence," even though he hadn't paid a cent towards bills. In October 1961, Robert's patience for his son-in-law had run out. Robert didn't just hate Edward, he also blamed him for the recent problems in his marriage to Julia. There were even rumors that Edward was having an affair with Julia. Then, one day in October, Edward chastised Robert for closing a door, so Robert smacked him in the face and ordered him out of the house or he would kill him. A month later, Edward, Christine, and the baby moved into the house where the baby would die and where Christine was fatally wounded. Around the same time, Julia filed for a divorce from Robert because she feared how violent he was. Robert was interviewed by the police 3 weeks after the murders. He said at the time of the murders, he was on an Alaskan airline flight from Miami to New York, and he checked into his hotel at 3:15 a.m. But there were two problems with his alibi. The first is that Alaskan Airlines didn't have a flight from Miami to New York City at that time. Only one airline had a flight from Miami to New York City that night, and it was Paramount Airlines. Another problem with Robert's alibi is that a friend of the family tried calling Robert at 4 a.m. in his hotel room, but there was no answer. He couldn't get a hold of Robert until 8:10 a.m. There's no record of the police or the FBI checking out these discrepancies, probably because they were convinced that Edward was the killer. The problem with the theory of Robert being the killer, or hiring someone to commit the murders, is why would he do it? Yes, Robert hated Edward because he thought that Edward was an entitled deadbeat who ruined his marriage, so he had motive to kill him. But either beating or having his daughter beat to death and then leaving his granddaughter to die in the house after it was set on fire, while making Edward disappear to make it look like he committed the murder, seems grotesquely sadistic for a motive like that. Why not just make Edward disappear and let his daughter and granddaughter live? The police never publicly considered Robert Walbach as a suspect in the murders of his daughter and his granddaughter and the disappearance of his son-in-law. If he was responsible, he took that secret to his grave when he died several years ago. Thanks for watching this week's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you liked it, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Sunday. Of course, thanks to everyone who already has subscribed. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. The links are in the information below the video. But that's all for this week. Thanks again for watching.